The rain came down in sheets so thick that Dustin McCoy could barely see his horse's ears as he rode through the muddy streets of Sheridan, Wyoming. And when he spotted her standing there on that covered porch, soaked to the bone and shaking like a leaf in winter, something inside his chest twisted hard enough to make him forget where he'd been heading in the first place. Her dark hair clung to her face and neck, her dress plastered against her frame, and she was rattling the doorknob with both hands like her life depended on getting inside that house. But the door wasn't budging an inch. Dustin pulled his gelding to a stop right there in front of the small clapboard house, rain drumming against his hat brim and running in rivers off his oilskin coat. The woman hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on that stubborn door, and he could hear her voice now, frustrated and frightened all at once, talking to herself or maybe to God about how she'd just stepped out for 1 minute, just 1 minute to check if her chickens were secure in their coop before the storm got worse. And now the wind had slammed the door shut and the latch had fallen into place, and she was locked out with the temperature dropping and the rain turning colder by the second. "Madam," Dustin called out, swinging down from his saddle and leading his horse closer to the porch. "Madam, you need some help there?" She spun around, eyes wide and startled, one hand flying to her throat. Up close, even with the rain and the failing light of the September evening, he could see she was young, maybe 23 or 24, with eyes the color of honey and a face that would have been pretty as a picture if it wasn't currently twisted with worry and cold. Her lips had started to turn a faint shade of blue. "I'm locked out," she said, and her voice trembled. "The door, the wind caught it, and now I cannot get back inside, and I do not have another key, and my landlord is 3 miles out of town, and this rain, it is so cold." Dustin stepped up onto the porch, water streaming off him, and he examined the door with a practiced eye. It was solid enough, and the lock looked like it had seated itself good and proper. He could probably force it, but that would mean damaging the frame, and from the looks of this place, the woman didn't have money to spare for repairs. "How long you been out here?" he asked, already shrugging out of his oilskin coat. "Maybe 20 minutes, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "I kept thinking I could get it open, but I cannot. I just cannot. Here." He draped the coat around her shoulders, and she looked up at him with such grateful surprise that he felt that twist in his chest again. "You are freezing. This door is not opening tonight without breaking it down, and I do not think you want that." "No," she agreed quickly. "No, I cannot afford to fix it. I just started working at the millinery shop 2 weeks ago. I barely have enough for rent and food." Dustin made a decision right then, the kind that came easy when you'd spent 10 years riding the range and learning to trust your gut about people and situations. "I have a room at the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson's place over on Main Street. She is a respectable woman, runs a respectable establishment. You can come there, get warm, get dry, and we will figure out what to do about your door come morning." The woman stared at him, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes, the calculation of risks and propriety against the very real danger of staying out in this cold rain all night. Her teeth chattered audibly. "I do not know you," she said finally. "Name is Dustin McCoy. I work for the Bar 7 Ranch. Been in these parts about 3 months now. You can ask anyone in town about me. I have no bad reputation to speak of." He paused, then added, "And you can ask Mrs. Patterson herself. She will not let me bring you into that house if she thinks there is anything improper about it. She is fiercer than a mama bear when it comes to the women under her roof." Another moment of hesitation, then the woman nodded, pulling his coat tighter around herself. "Rose Keller," she said, "and I accept your offer because I think I might actually freeze if I do not." Dustin helped her down from the porch and up onto his horse, then swung up behind her, keeping his arms loose around her as he took the reins. She was shaking so hard he could feel it through both their layers of clothing, and he urged the gelding into a quick walk toward Main Street, trying to shield her as much as possible from the driving rain. The boarding house glowed with lamplight when they arrived, warm and welcoming against the dark storm, and Mrs. Patterson herself answered Dustin's knock. She was a woman of about 50, with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and those eyes went from Dustin to Rose and back again in the space of a heartbeat. "Found her locked out of her house in this weather," Dustin explained quickly. "She needs somewhere warm and dry for the night, and I figured you might have a spare room." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened immediately, and she reached out to pull Rose inside. "Oh, you poor dear, you're soaked clean through. Come in right now. Mr. McCoy, you did the right thing bringing her here." She shot him an approving look. "You can stable your horse out back, then come in through the kitchen. I will have coffee on." Dustin did as he was told, taking his time with the gelding to give Mrs. Patterson a chance to get Rose settled. By the time he came in through the back door, shaking water off his hat, he could hear voices from upstairs and the sound of footsteps moving around. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and settled into a chair at the kitchen table, suddenly aware of how tired he was after a long day of riding fence lines in weather that had been threatening rain since dawn. Mrs. Patterson came bustling back downstairs about 15 minutes later, carrying Rose's wet dress and underthings. "I've given her one of my nightgowns and a robe," she announced, draping the wet clothing over a rack near the stove. "She's warming up with a hot bath right now, poor thing. She said she has been in town less than a month, came from Pennsylvania after her father died, and left her with nothing but debts." Dustin's jaw tightened at that. He knew that story too well, had seen it play out 100 times across the West. Women left alone with no resources, forced to make their way in a world that didn't make things easy for them. "She have any family here?" he asked. "Not a soul. Just that job at the millinery shop. And from what she said, Mrs. Hendricks only pays her enough to cover that little house and basic necessities." Mrs. Patterson shook her head, pouring herself a cup of coffee and sitting down across from Dustin. "You did good bringing her here. Another hour in that rain, and she would have been truly ill." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside and the quieter sounds of the house settling around them. Dustin found his thoughts drifting back to that first sight of Rose on the porch, the desperation in her movements as she'd fought with that door, and the way her eyes had looked when he'd offered her his coat. There had been something there, some spark of connection that he couldn't quite name but felt nonetheless. Rose came downstairs eventually, wrapped in a thick blue robe with her dark hair damp but no longer dripping, her feet bare, and her face finally returning to a normal color. She looked younger this way, softer, and Dustin found himself standing up without quite meaning to. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Much better, thank you." She smiled at him, a real smile this time, and it transformed her whole face. "I cannot thank you enough, Mr. McCoy. If you had not come along when you did, I do not know what I would have done." "Dustin," he said, Dustin is fine. Then you must call me Rose." She moved further into the kitchen, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Patterson offered her and wrapping both hands around it like it was precious. "I feel so foolish, getting locked out like that. I should have been more careful." "Was not your fault," Dustin said firmly. "Wind in a storm like this does not ask permission. Could have happened to anyone." Mrs. Patterson nodded her agreement. "Now, Rose dear, I have made up the room at the end of the hall for you. It is small but comfortable, and you are welcome to stay as long as you need. We can discuss arrangements in the morning." "I cannot impose," Rose started to say, but Mrs. Patterson waved her off. "Nonsense! You are not imposing, you are being helped, and there is a difference. Besides, I have been looking for someone to help with the mending and the cooking, and if you are interested in earning your keep that way, we can work something out that benefits us both." Rose's eyes went bright, and Dustin realized with a start that she was fighting back tears. That would be more than generous, Mrs. Patterson. "Thank you." They talked for a while longer, the three of them there in the warm kitchen, while the storm continued to batter the town outside. Dustin learned that Rose had worked in a hat shop back in Pennsylvania too, that she had dreams of maybe opening her own place someday if she could save enough money, that she loved reading and missed having access to more than the handful of books she'd been able to bring west with her. She had a way of talking that drew you in, made you want to hear more, and her laugh when it finally came was like music cutting through the sound of the rain. It was past 10 when Dustin finally stood to take his leave, knowing he had to be up before dawn to ride back out to the ranch. Rose walked him to the front door, still wrapped in that robe, and when she looked up at him in the dim hallway light, something passed between them that felt significant, in a way Dustin couldn't quite articulate. "Thank you again," she said softly. "You are a kind man, Dustin McCoy." "Just doing what anyone would do," he replied. but they both knew that wasn't quite true. Plenty of men would have ridden right past a woman in trouble, especially in weather like this. "Will I see you again?" The question came out almost shy, and Dustin felt something warm unfurl in his chest. "I come to town most Saturdays," he said, "and I reckon I will want to check on you, make sure you got back into your house all right and everything is sorted." Rose smiled. "I would like that." Dustin rode back out to the ranch through the dying storm, his oilskin coat once again keeping most of the rain off him, but his mind wasn't on the weather or the muddy road, or even the warm bunk waiting for him. His mind was full of honey-colored eyes and a smile that had made his heart skip, and he knew with the certainty of a man who had never felt quite this way before that Rose Keller was going to be important to him, maybe the most important person he'd ever met. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the early hours. Dustin was up with the sun, helping with the morning feeding and then approaching his boss, Jacob Morrison, about taking an hour or two to ride into town. "That woman you helped last night," Jacob said, because news traveled fast even out at the ranch. "She get settled all right?" "Yes, sir, but I want to check on her house, see if I can get that door open proper so she can get her things." Jacob, a weathered man of 45 who had been ranching in Wyoming since before Dustin was born, studied him with knowing eyes. "Pretty, is she?" Dustin felt heat climb his neck. "That is not why I'm helping her." "Did not say it was, but I have known you 3 months now, McCoy, and you are not the type to go out of your way unless something about a situation speaks to you." He grinned. "Go on, get into town, but I need you back by noon. We have cattle to move." Dustin made good time into Sheridan, the morning sun already starting to dry out the muddy streets. He stopped first at the boarding house where Mrs. Patterson informed him that Rose had already left for her job at the millinery shop, but had asked if he might be able to help with her door situation. "She gave me this," Mrs. Patterson said, handing him a small key. "Says it is for the back door, which should not have locked. You should be able to get in that way and open the front from the inside." Armed with this information, Dustin headed over to Rose's little house. It looked even smaller in the daylight, a modest clapboard structure with a tiny porch and a yard that was mostly mud after the storm. He made his way around back, found the door Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, and sure enough, the key turned smoothly in the lock. The interior of the house was sparse but clean, with a small front room that served as both kitchen and living space, and what looked like a bedroom, barely big enough for a narrow bed through a doorway at the back. Rose's possessions were few. Some dishes, a change of clothes hanging from pegs on the wall, a small stack of books on an upturned crate serving as a table, a well-worn quilt on the bed. It made Dustin's chest ache to see how little she had, how hard she must be working just to keep this roof over her head. He opened the front door from the inside, checking the latch mechanism. It was old and loose, and he could see how the wind might have caused it to fall into place and lock the door. He spent 20 minutes tightening screws and adjusting the mechanism so it wouldn't happen again, then tested it several times to make sure it was working properly. Before he left, Dustin found himself looking around the little house again, noting the way Rose had tried to make it homey despite having so little. She'd put wildflowers in a chipped cup on the windowsill, arranged her few books with care, folded her spare dress neatly on the one chair. It spoke of someone who took pride in what she had, who wasn't defeated by her circumstances. He locked up with the back door key and headed over to the millinery shop, a neat little establishment on Main Street with a window display full of bonnets and ribbons. A bell chimed when he opened the door, and a sharp-faced woman of about 40 looked up from behind the counter. "Help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear she thought a cowboy had no business in a hat shop. "Looking for Miss Keller," Dustin said politely, removing his hat. "I have her house key to return." The woman, who must be Mrs. Hendricks, sniffed disapprovingly but turned and called toward the back room. "Rose, someone here for you." Rose emerged a moment later, and her whole face lit up when she saw Dustin standing there. She was wearing a simple gray dress, her dark hair pinned up neatly, and she had a measuring tape draped around her neck and pins stuck in a cushion on her wrist. "Dustin, you came." She moved toward him, then seemed to remember where she was and slowed, composing herself. Were you able to?" "Fixed your door," he said, holding out the key. "Tightened up the latch mechanism so it should not happen again. But you might want to think about getting a new lock eventually. That one is pretty worn." "Thank you." Rose took the key, her fingers brushing his for just a moment, and Dustin felt that touch all the way through him. "I do not know how I can repay you for everything you have done. No repayment needed." He hesitated, aware of Mrs. Hendricks watching them with eagle eyes, then plunged ahead. "But I meant what I said last night about coming to town on Saturdays. If you were free tomorrow afternoon, maybe you would let me buy you lunch at the hotel restaurant." Rose's smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "I would like that very much. I finish work at 1 o'clock. I will meet you here then." Dustin left the shop feeling like he was walking on air, and the ribbing he took from the other ranch hands when he got back to the Bar 7 and they heard about his plans for Saturday barely registered. He had a date with Rose Keller, and that was all that mattered. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. Dustin found himself watching the days tick by with an impatience that was foreign to him, a man who usually took life as it came. He caught himself thinking about Rose at odd moments, wondering what she was doing, whether she was warm enough in that little house, whether she thought about him the way he thought about her. It was unsettling and exhilarating all at once. When Saturday finally arrived, Dustin took extra care with his appearance, washing up thoroughly and putting on his best shirt, the dark blue one without any patches or frayed cuffs. He even borrowed some bay rum from Charlie Dawson, one of the other hands, which earned him a knowing grin and a comment about being sweet on someone. "Shut up," Dustin said without heat, and Charlie just laughed. Rose was waiting outside the millinery shop when Dustin rode into town at precisely 1 o'clock. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, a soft green color that brought out the gold in her eyes, and she'd done something different with her hair, pulling it back in a way that showed off the graceful line of her neck. She was beautiful, and Dustin felt something in his chest constrict just looking at her. "Right on time," she said as he dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. "Would not want to keep you waiting." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked together down Main Street toward the Sheridan Hotel, and Dustin was acutely aware of people watching them, of the speculation that would be flying around town by evening. He didn't care. The hotel restaurant was busy with the Saturday lunch crowd, but they managed to get a table by the window. Dustin ordered steak and potatoes while Rose chose chicken and dumplings, and they made awkward small talk about the weather and the town until their food arrived and the initial nervousness began to wear off. "Tell me about Pennsylvania," Dustin said, cutting into his steak. "What was it like growing up there?" Rose's expression turned wistful. "Different from here. Greener, more crowded. My father ran a small printing business and we lived above the shop. I was an only child, so I spent a lot of time reading and helping in the shop. It was a good life until my father got sick." "How long ago did you lose him?" 4 months now. He had been ill for almost a year before that, and the medical bills ate through everything we had saved. When he passed, I discovered he had borrowed money to pay for treatments, and the debts were more than I could cover. I had to sell the shop, sell our furniture, sell almost everything, and it still wasn't enough. I had a distant cousin who had moved out west years ago to Montana, and I thought maybe I could find her, start fresh somewhere new." She paused, taking a sip of her water. "I made it as far as Sheridan before my money ran out. The cousin had moved on, no one knew where, and I was stuck. Mrs. Hendricks needed help in the shop, so here I am." Dustin's heart ached for her, for all she had lost and how alone she must feel. "Do you like it here?" "I am learning to," Rose said carefully. "It is very different from what I knew. Wilder, rougher. But there is something about it, something about the openness and the sky and the mountains in the distance. It feels like there is room to breathe here, room to become something new." "I know what you mean," Dustin said. "I came from Texas originally, grew up on a small farm that never quite made enough to keep us comfortable. Left home at 18 to make my own way, and I've been drifting ever since, taking ranch jobs where I can find them. Been all over, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, now here. Something about Wyoming feels different, though. Feels like maybe a place I could stay." They talked through the meal and well past it, coffee growing cold in their cups as they discovered shared loves of reading and horses and quiet mornings before the world woke up. Rose told him about the books she missed from her father's shop, and Dustin promised to see what he could find at the general store. He told her about life on the ranch, the hard work and the simple pleasures, the satisfaction of a job well done, and the camaraderie of good men working together. When they finally left the restaurant, the afternoon sun was already starting to slant toward evening. Dustin walked Rose back to the boarding house, reluctant to let the day end, but knowing he had to get back to the ranch. "Thank you for lunch," Rose said when they reached Mrs. Patterson's front steps. "I had a wonderful time." "So did I." Dustin took a breath, gathering his courage. "Rose, I know we have only just met, but I would like to see you again, not just as someone who helped you out of a bad situation, but as someone who wants to know you better, spend time with you. Would that be all right?" Rose's smile was radiant. "I would like that very much, Dustin." "Next Saturday, then? Maybe we could take a walk if the weather's nice." "Yes, next Saturday." Dustin rode back to the ranch with his heart feeling lighter than it had in years, maybe ever. There was something about Rose that called to him on a level deeper than simple attraction, though he certainly found her attractive enough. It was the way she spoke, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength she showed in facing a situation that would have broken many people. She was remarkable, and he wanted to know everything about her. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that became the highlight of Dustin's existence. Every Saturday he would ride into town, and he and Rose would spend the afternoon together, walking the streets of Sheridan, sitting by the creek that ran behind the town, talking about everything and nothing. He learned that she was 23 to his 26, that her favorite color was blue, that she had always wanted to see the ocean. She learned that he had never known his mother, who died when he was born, that his father had been a hard man who showed love through providing rather than affection, that Dustin's greatest fear was ending up alone. "You will not," Rose said firmly one afternoon in late October as they sat on a blanket beside the creek, watching the water flow past. "You are too good a man to end up alone." "You think I am a good man?" Dustin asked, turning to look at her. The autumn sun caught in her hair, turning it to shades of mahogany and gold, and he thought he had never seen anything so beautiful. "I know you are," Rose said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You proved that the night you found me in the rain." Dustin reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and Rose leaned into the touch, her eyes falling half-closed. "Rose," he said, his voice rough, "I need you to know I have feelings for you, strong feelings. You are all I think about, all I want. If that is too much, if I am moving too fast, tell me now, and I will step back." "You're not moving too fast," Rose whispered. "I feel the same way. I've been waiting for you to say something because I was afraid to speak first, afraid of being too forward." Dustin felt relief and joy flood through him in equal measure. He leaned in, still moving slowly, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and perfect. Rose kissed him back, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, and Dustin felt like his heart might burst from the sheer rightness of the moment. They drew back after a few seconds, both breathing a little harder, and Rose's cheeks were flushed pink in a way that made Dustin want to kiss her again immediately. "I am courting you," he announced, making it official. "Properly courting you, if that is all right with you." "More than all right," Rose said, her eyes shining. "Yes, Dustin, yes." The courtship that followed was everything Dustin had ever dreamed of and nothing he had ever expected to find. Despite the constraints of their situations, him working long hours at the ranch and her tied to the millinery shop 6 days a week, they found ways to be together. Dustin started taking his meals at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house on Saturday evenings, sitting at the communal table but really only having eyes for Rose. They took long walks in the growing cold of autumn, and Dustin gave her his coat when she shivered, loving the way she burrowed into it like it was the safest place in the world. In November, the first real snow came, and Dustin taught Rose to throw snowballs, laughing as she shrieked and ran from his aim. They built a snowman in the yard behind the boarding house, and Mrs. Patterson watched from the window with an approving smile, because it was clear to everyone who saw them together that this was real, that these two people had found something special. Christmas approached, and Dustin fretted about what to give Rose. He had very little money saved, most of his pay going to basics and a small amount he sent back to his aging father in Texas. But he wanted to give her something meaningful, something that would show her how much she meant to him. In the end, he remembered her talking about the book she missed, and he commissioned the general store owner to order a leather-bound volume of poetry from a catalog. It cost more than he could really afford, but when it arrived 3 days before Christmas and he saw the quality of the binding and the gilt-edged pages, he knew it was worth it. Rose had been staying at the boarding house since that rainy night in September, trading work for her room and board, and she'd given up the lease on her little house. Mrs. Patterson treated her like the daughter she had never had, and Rose bloomed under the older woman's care, gaining weight she had needed and losing the pinched, worried look she had worn when Dustin first met her. They exchanged gifts on Christmas Eve, sitting in the parlor of the boarding house with Mrs. Patterson's little Christmas tree glowing with candles in the corner. Rose gasped when she opened the book, her hands trembling as she touched the cover. "Dustin, this is too much. You should not have spent so much." "You are worth it," he said simply. "You are worth everything." Rose's gift to him was more modest but no less meaningful, a warm scarf she had knitted herself in dark blue wool, working on it in the evenings after he left and hiding it away so he wouldn't see. When she wrapped it around his neck, her fingers lingering against his skin, Dustin felt a lump form in his throat. "I love you," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I do. I love you, Rose." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too, Dustin McCoy. I have loved you since you gave me your coat in the rain." They kissed then, a longer, deeper kiss than any they had shared before, and when they finally pulled apart, Mrs. Patterson was discreetly absent, having left them alone for this moment. "Marry me," Dustin said, still holding her close. "I know I do not have much to offer you right now, just a cowboy's wages and a bunk at the ranch, but I will work hard, I will save money, I will give you the best life I can. Marry me, Rose. Say you will be my wife." Rose was crying openly now, but her smile was brilliant. "Yes. Yes, Dustin, I will marry you. I will absolutely marry you." They were married in February of 1888, on a cold, bright day with the mountains standing clear and sharp against a blue sky. The ceremony took place in the little church in Sheridan, with Mrs. Patterson and several of the ranch hands serving as witnesses. Rose wore a dress of cream-colored wool that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and she carried a small bouquet of dried flowers because nothing bloomed in the Wyoming winter. Dustin wore his best clothes and the scarf Rose had made him, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Dustin kissed his bride with all the love and hope and promise he had in his heart. The problem of where to live had been solved by Jacob Morrison, who had pulled Dustin aside a week before the wedding with an offer that left Dustin speechless. There was a small cabin on the ranch property, currently used for storage, that Jacob was willing to let Dustin fix up and live in with his new wife. It needed work, but it had good bones and a sound roof, and it would be theirs. Dustin threw himself into the repairs with the help of his fellow ranch hands, working every spare moment to make the cabin livable. They patched holes, replaced broken windows, cleaned years of accumulated dust and debris. Rose came out to see it 2 days before the wedding and immediately started planning where furniture would go, how she would arrange their small collection of possessions to make it a home. The night of their wedding, Dustin carried Rose over the threshold of that little cabin, and she looked around with shining eyes at what he had done. Someone, probably Mrs. Patterson, had been there earlier and left a fire burning in the hearth and wildflowers on the small table. There was a real bed now instead of just a bunk, and Rose had sewn curtains for the windows, and it was small and simple, but it was theirs. "Welcome home, Mrs. McCoy," Dustin said, setting Rose on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Home," Rose repeated, and kissed him. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, and everything Dustin could have hoped for, the two of them learning each other in the firelight, taking their time despite their inexperience, because they had all the time in the world now. Rose was shy at first, but grew bolder as the night went on, and Dustin tried his best to be gentle and patient, putting her comfort and pleasure above his own. When they finally fell asleep tangled together in their marriage bed, Dustin thought he had never been happier or more content in his entire life. Married life suited them both. Rose quit her job at the millinery shop, deciding she wanted to focus on making their cabin a home, and eventually, they hoped, raising a family. She took in sewing and mending from people in town to earn a little extra money, and she started a small garden plot as soon as the ground thawed in the spring, determined to grow vegetables to supplement their diet. Dustin worked harder than ever at the ranch, driven by the desire to provide for his wife, and proved to Jacob that his faith in them had been justified. He took on extra duties, volunteered for the jobs no one else wanted, and saved every penny he could. Rose was a miracle worker with their small budget, making their money stretch further than Dustin would have thought possible, cooking hearty meals from simple ingredients and never complaining about what they didn't have. By summer, they had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dustin would rise before dawn and head out with the other hands to work cattle or mend fences or whatever the day required. He would come home in the evening to find Rose waiting for him, the cabin filled with good smells and warmth, and they would eat together and talk about their days and make plans for the future. On Sundays, their day off, they would ride into town for church and then spend the afternoon exploring the countryside around Sheridan, just the two of them and the vast Wyoming landscape. In August, Rose made an announcement that filled Dustin with equal parts joy and terror. She was expecting a baby, due sometime in March of the following year. Dustin picked her up and spun her around, whooping with delight, then immediately set her down and fussed over whether he had been too rough, whether she should sit down, whether she needed anything. Rose laughed at him, her hands on his face. "I am fine, Dustin. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am going to be fine, and our child is going to be fine." But Dustin worried nonetheless because he had heard too many stories of women who didn't survive childbirth, of babies who came too early or too late or not at all. He became protective to the point of being overprotective, hovering whenever Rose did anything more strenuous than stirring a pot, insisting she rest more and work less. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Rose told him one afternoon in September when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. But her eyes were fond, and she kissed him to take the sting out of the words. The months of Rose's pregnancy were simultaneously the longest and shortest of Dustin's life. He watched his wife's body change with a sense of wonder and awe, saw her bloom into an even more beautiful version of herself despite the discomforts she faced. Her belly grew round and firm, and Dustin took to falling asleep each night with his hand resting on it, feeling their child move and kick inside her. They spent the winter preparing for the baby's arrival, making plans and gathering supplies. Rose sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric she collected from her mending work, and Dustin built a cradle from wood Jacob let him take from the ranch stores, sanding it smooth and rubbing it with beeswax until it shone. They argued playfully over names, each trying to convince the other that their choice was best, and in the end, they decided to wait until the baby was born and see what seemed to fit. March came in cold and blustery, and Rose's time drew near. Mrs. Patterson came out to the cabin to stay with them, taking over the household duties and keeping a watchful eye on Rose. The midwife from town, a capable woman named Mrs. Carson, stopped by regularly to check on Rose's progress and assure them that everything looked normal and healthy. The pains started on a Tuesday morning just after dawn. Dustin was getting ready to head out to work when Rose gasped and pressed a hand to her belly, and he knew immediately what was happening. Mrs. Patterson took charge, sending Dustin to fetch Mrs. Carson and then banishing him from the cabin once the midwife arrived. "You will just be in the way," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, though not unkindly. "Go chop wood or walk or do something, but do not pace outside the door. You will wear a rut in the ground." Dustin did all of those things over the course of the long day that followed. He chopped enough wood to last them a month, walked miles around the ranch property, tried to work and couldn't focus on anything except the sounds coming from inside the cabin. Rose's cries of pain tore at him, made him want to burst through the door and do something, anything, to help her. But he knew he couldn't. This was her battle to fight, and all he could do was wait and pray. Evening was falling when the door finally opened, and Mrs. Patterson emerged, looking tired but smiling. "You have a son," she announced, "a big, healthy boy, and Rose is doing well. Come meet your child, Dustin." Dustin nearly tripped over his own feet in his haste to get inside. The cabin was warm and dim, lit by lamplight and the glow of the fire. Rose was propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat and her face flushed, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come see him," Rose said softly. And Dustin approached the bed on shaking legs. He looked down at his son for the first time and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest, in his soul. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. His eyes were screwed shut, and he was making small snuffling noises that Dustin found absurdly endearing. "He is perfect," Dustin managed, his voice thick. "Rose, he is absolutely perfect." "I think so too." Rose looked up at him with tired eyes full of love. "What should we name him?" They had settled on several possibilities, but looking at his son now, Dustin knew exactly what felt right. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Morrison McCoy, after your father and the man who gave us this place to live. What do you think?" "I think it is perfect," Rose said, and held out the baby. "Hold your son, Dustin." Dustin took the tiny bundle with trembling hands, terrified he would drop him or hold him wrong or somehow break this fragile new life. But Daniel settled into his arms like he belonged there, and Dustin felt tears prick his eyes as he looked down at the child he and Rose had created. "Hello, Daniel," he whispered. "I am your papa, and I promise I'm going to do everything in my power to give you a good life, to keep you safe and happy and loved. You are already the most important thing in the world to me." Rose watched them with tears streaming down her face, and Mrs. Patterson discreetly left to give the new family some privacy. Dustin sat carefully on the edge of the bed, still holding Daniel, and Rose leaned her head against his shoulder. "We did it," she said. "We made a family." "We did," Dustin agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "We really did." The months that followed were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Daniel proved to be a robust baby with healthy lungs and a healthy appetite, keeping Rose busy with constant feedings while Dustin juggled his ranch work with helping as much as he could at home. Neither of them got much sleep, but somehow it didn't matter because there was such joy in the chaos, such wonder in watching their son grow and change day by day. Dustin discovered reserves of patience and gentleness he hadn't known he possessed, rocking Daniel through fussy evenings and changing nappies without complaint, and falling even more in love with his wife as he watched her navigate motherhood with grace and determination. Rose amazed him daily with her strength and capability, managing to care for Daniel and maintain their home, and still greet Dustin each evening with a smile and a kiss. By the time Daniel was 6 months old and starting to sit up on his own, Dustin felt like they had hit their stride as parents. The initial panic of the early days had faded into a comfortable confidence, and they worked together as a team in a way that felt natural and right. Jacob Morrison had given Dustin a raise after Daniel's birth, acknowledging the increased responsibilities of a family man, and they were able to save a little money each month now, building toward a future that felt increasingly secure. One evening in October, after putting Daniel to bed, Rose and Dustin sat together on the small porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains in the distance. Rose was tucked against Dustin's side, his arm around her shoulders, and they were content to just sit in silence for a while, enjoying the peace in each other's company. "I have been thinking," Rose said eventually, "about how we met." "In the rain," Dustin said, smiling at the memory. "You were so angry at that door." "I was terrified," Rose corrected. "I was cold and scared, and I did not know what I was going to do. And then you appeared like some kind of answer to a prayer I did not even know I was praying." Dustin tightened his arm around her. "I'm just glad I was riding through town at the right time." "It was more than that, though," Rose insisted, turning to look up at him. "You could have ridden right past. Most people would have, but you stopped. You helped. You took me somewhere safe, even though you did not know me and had no reason to trust that I was not going to cause you trouble." "You could never be trouble," Dustin said, cupping her face with his free hand. "From the moment I saw you, I knew you were something special. Maybe I did not know right away that I would fall in love with you, but I knew you were important. I knew I had to help." "I fell in love with you that night," Rose admitted, "when you wrapped your coat around me and your only concern was making sure I was safe and warm. No one had cared for me like that since my father died. You gave me back my hope, Dustin. You gave me everything." They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, and Dustin thought about how much had changed in the 2 years since that rainy September night. He had been a drifting cowboy with no real roots or ties, and now he was a husband and a father with a home and a family and a future that stretched out bright and promising before him. all because he had stopped to help a woman in trouble, and she had turned out to be the other half of his soul. The years rolled on, bringing changes and challenges, but also so much joy. Daniel grew into a bright, adventurous toddler who kept Rose on her toes and made Dustin's heart overflow with pride. 2 years after Daniel's birth, Rose gave them a daughter, Emma Rose McCoy, who came into the world with her mother's honey-colored eyes and a disposition as sweet as summer sunshine. Dustin was terrified all over again through Rose's second labor, but it went smoothly and quickly. And when Mrs. Carson placed his daughter in his arms, Dustin felt his heart expand to make room for even more love. They needed more space now with 2 children, and Dustin spent every spare moment that summer building an addition onto the cabin, expanding it into a proper 2-bedroom house. Jacob continued to be generous and supportive, giving Dustin more responsibilities at the ranch and a foreman position that came with a significant increase in pay. They were far from wealthy, but they were comfortable in a way neither of them had ever expected to be, and they were happy. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dustin took Rose back into town for dinner at the hotel restaurant, the same place where they had shared their first meal together. Mrs. Patterson happily agreed to watch the children, and Dustin and Rose, dressed in their best clothes and rode into Sheridan together, holding hands like newlyweds. "Do you remember what we talked about that first time?" Rose asked, as they waited for their food to arrive. "You asked me about Pennsylvania, and I told you about losing my father." "I remember everything about that day," Dustin said. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, and the strongest, because you had been through so much, but you had not let it break you." "I felt broken," Rose admitted. "Before I met you, I felt like I was barely holding myself together. And then you came along and you were so kind, so good, and slowly you helped me put myself back together. You gave me a reason to keep going." "You did the same for me," Dustin told her, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I was drifting before I met you, Rose, just moving from place to place with no real purpose or direction. You gave me roots. You gave me a home, not just a place to live, but a home in the truest sense. You and Daniel and Emma. You are my whole world." Rose's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you, Dustin McCoy, more now than I did on the day we married, and I thought that was not possible." "I love you too," Dustin said, "more than anything in this world." They ate their meal and talked and laughed, remembering their courtship and their early days of marriage, the struggles they had faced and overcome together. When they finally headed back to the ranch to collect their children, Dustin felt a deep sense of contentment and gratitude for the life they had built. More years passed, bringing more changes. Daniel started school in town, riding in with Dustin when he had to go to Sheridan for ranch business. Emma followed 2 years later, and the house seemed quieter during the days, though Rose filled the time with her sewing work and tending an ever-expanding garden. Dustin continued to rise through the ranks at the Bar 7, and when Jacob Morrison announced his intention to retire in 1897, he sold the ranch to a consortium that included Dustin as a minority partner. It was a dream Dustin had never dared to have. Part ownership in a successful ranch, and it would not have been possible without the reputation he had built over nearly a decade of hard work and the savings he and Rose had carefully accumulated. They had a 3rd child in 1896, another son they named Thomas after Dustin's father, who had passed away the year before. This baby was quieter than his siblings, more contemplative, and he seemed content to just observe the world around him with wide, curious eyes. Rose doted on him, as did Daniel and Emma, and Dustin marveled at the fact that he was a father to 3 healthy, happy children. One evening in the summer of 1899, with Daniel now a gangly 11-year-old, Emma a precocious 9, and Thomas a busy 3-year-old, the whole family sat outside their house watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Dustin had built a proper porch by now, with room for chairs and space for the children to play, and this had become their favorite time of day, when the work was done and they could all just be together. "Papa," Daniel said, leaning against Dustin's knee, "tell us again about how you met Mama." It was a story the children had heard dozens of times, but they never seemed to tire of it. Dustin looked over at Rose, who smiled and nodded, and he launched into the familiar tale of a rainy September night, a locked door, and a woman who needed help. "Nah, I was just riding through town," Dustin said. And I saw your mama standing there in the rain, trying so hard to get that door open, and I thought, that is a person who needs help, and I can help her. So I did." "And you fell in love," Emma said dreamily, as she always did at this part. "And we fell in love," Dustin confirmed, reaching out to take Rose's hand. "Because sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we are not expecting them, when we are just going about our business and then suddenly everything changes." "I am glad you helped Mama," Daniel said seriously. "Otherwise, we would not be here." "I am very glad too," Dustin said, his voice thick with emotion. "Helping your mama was the best decision I ever made because it brought me all of you." Rose squeezed his hand, and in her eyes, Dustin could see all the love and history and shared experiences of their 11 years together. They had built something beautiful from that chance meeting in the rain, built a family and a life that neither of them could have imagined in those early uncertain days. Thomas fell asleep against Rose's shoulder, and Emma started yawning, and eventually they all headed inside to begin the evening routines of washing up and getting ready for bed. Dustin helped Rose tuck the children in, kissing each of them goodnight and listening to their prayers. And then finally, he and Rose were alone in their own room, the house quiet around them. "Happy?" Rose asked as they got ready for bed. "Happier than I have any right to be," Dustin said honestly. "I have a family I love, work I find satisfying, a stake in a successful ranch. I have you, Rose. I have everything." "We have everything," Rose corrected, coming to stand in front of him and wrapping her arms around his waist. "We have built this together, Dustin. Everything we have, everything we are, we made it as partners." "Best partnership I have ever known," Dustin said, resting his forehead against hers. "I would do it all again, every single moment, just to end up right here with you." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that had never dimmed between them. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Dustin thought back to that cowboy he had been 11 years earlier, riding through the rain with no particular place to go and no one waiting for him. He barely recognized that man now, could hardly remember what it felt like to be so alone and untethered. The turn of the century came and went, bringing with it a sense of change and possibility. The West was becoming less wild, more settled, with railroads connecting distant places and modern conveniences starting to reach even small towns like Sheridan. Dustin and Rose navigated these changes together, adapting while holding on to the values and ways of life that mattered most to them. Daniel grew into a responsible young man who showed a natural aptitude for ranch work, and Dustin began teaching him the business with an eye toward the future. Emma developed a passion for reading that rivaled Rose's, and she talked about maybe becoming a teacher someday. Thomas was still young, but already showing signs of his father's steady temperament and his mother's kind heart. In 1902, Dustin and Rose celebrated their 14th wedding anniversary. They were both in their late 30s now, no longer the young couple who had married with more hope than resources. Rose had lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting into the sun and smiling, and Dustin's hair was starting to show threads of silver at his temples. But they were healthy and strong, and more in love than ever, and their children were thriving. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not stopped that night?" Dustin asked one quiet Sunday afternoon as he and Rose sat on their porch watching the children play in the yard. "If I had just ridden past." "Sometimes," Rose admitted, "but not often, because it hurts too much to imagine. You saved me, Dustin, not just from the rain and the cold, but from the loneliness and fear of facing the world alone. You gave me a life I could not have dreamed of." "You saved me too," Dustin said. "I was so lost before I met you, Rose. I did not even know how lost until I found you and realized what I had been missing. You gave me purpose, direction, a reason to put down roots and build something that would last." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Daniel help Thomas climb a tree while Emma read under its shade, and Dustin felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. This was his life, these people were his people, and he had never wanted anything more than he already had right here. The years continued to roll by, bringing the usual mixture of joys and sorrows that make up a life. They lost Mrs. Patterson in 1904, and both Dustin and Rose mourned the woman who had been so instrumental in bringing them together and supporting them in their early days. The ranch continued to prosper under the new ownership structure, and Dustin's share brought them a level of financial security that would have seemed impossible in those early years. Daniel married at 21 to a sweet-natured girl from town named Sarah, and they gave Dustin and Rose their first grandchild, a boy, in 1911. Emma went off to teachers' college in Laramie, making her parents so proud they could barely contain themselves. Thomas, at 15, was already taller than his father and showing every sign of becoming an excellent rancher in his own right. On a warm September evening in 1913, 25 years after that fateful rainy night, Dustin and Rose sat together on their porch exactly as they had done countless times over the years. Their house had grown and changed with their family, expanding to accommodate visiting children and grandchildren, and the porch now wrapped around two sides of the building. But their favorite spot remained the same, the two chairs set close together where they could hold hands and watch the sun set over the mountains. 25 years, Rose said softly. Can you believe it has been that long? Feels like yesterday, Dustin said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles. Feels like forever. Feels like exactly the right amount of time. I would not change a single thing, Rose said. Not one moment, not one decision. It has all led us here, to this life, to this love, and I am grateful for every second of it. Dustin looked at his wife, at the woman who had been the center of his world for a quarter century, and he saw the girl he had found standing in the rain overlaid with the woman she had become. He saw every moment they had shared reflected in her eyes, every joy and sorrow, every triumph and challenge, and he loved her more in that moment than he ever had before, with a love that had been tested and proven and strengthened by the passage of time. I love you, Rose McCoy, he said. I loved you when I first saw you fighting with that door. I loved you when I married you. I loved you when you gave me our children, and I love you now. I will love you until the day I die and beyond, if such things are possible. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I love you too, Dustin. My rescuer, my partner, my best friend, my love. You are everything to me, and you always will be. They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that neither could have imagined alone. Around them, their family thrived, their children and grandchildren carrying forward the legacy of love and commitment that Dustin and Rose had established. Inside the house, photographs lined the walls, capturing moments from their years together. Their wedding day, each child is a baby, family gatherings and celebrations, the gradual expansion of their world. But the heart of it all, the foundation upon which everything else was built, was that moment in the rain when a cowboy stopped to help a woman in trouble and found his future waiting for him. It was a story that would be passed down through generations, a reminder that kindness and compassion can change the course of a life, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple choice to help someone in need. Years later, when Dustin was an old man with more gray hair than dark and Rose's face was lined with the evidence of a life well lived, they would still sit on that porch together and remember. They would hold hands and watch the sunset and marvel at the gift they had been given, the decades of love and laughter and family that had sprung from one rainy September night in 1887. Their children would tell their children the story, and those children would tell their children, and the tale of how Dustin saw Rose standing in the rain, locked out of her house and took her somewhere warm and safe, would become part of the family mythology, a touchstone and a reminder of where it all began. But for Dustin and Rose, it was never just a story. It was their story, the beginning of everything that mattered, the moment when two lonely souls found each other and discovered that together they could build something beautiful and lasting. When Dustin eventually passed away in 1925 at the age of 63, surrounded by his large and loving family, Rose held his hand and whispered, "Thank you for stopping that night. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me." And when Rose followed him 2 years later, her last words were of that first meeting, that moment when a stranger in an oilskin coat had offered her warmth and safety, and though neither of them knew it yet, a love that would last a lifetime. Their graves sit side by side in the Sheridan Cemetery, the headstones simple but eloquent, marking the final resting place of Dustin Morrison McCoy and Rose Keller McCoy. Beloved husband and wife, parents and grandparents, two people who found each other in the rain and never let go. And if you visit on a quiet evening when the wind whispers through the grass and the mountains stand purple against the setting sun, you might almost hear the echo of their love, still strong after all these years, a testament to the power of kindness and the enduring nature of true love. The McCoy Ranch continued to thrive under the stewardship of Daniel and his sons, and then his grandsons, each generation building on the foundation that Dustin and Rose had laid. The little cabin where it all began, expanded and modified over the years, was eventually preserved as a family landmark, a reminder of humble beginnings and the incredible journey that followed. Inside, in a place of honor, sat the leather-bound book of poetry that Dustin had given Rose that first Christmas, its pages yellowed with age but its significance undimmed. And so the story came full circle, as all good stories do, ending not in tragedy or loss but in triumph and love, in a life well lived and a legacy that would endure. Dustin McCoy had stopped to help a woman in trouble on a rainy September night, and in doing so, he had found his destiny. Rose Keller had been locked out of her house and rescued by a kind stranger, and in that rescue, she had found her soulmate. Together, they had built a family, a home, a life that stood as proof that sometimes the most extraordinary things can grow from the simplest acts of compassion. Their love story, begun in rain and desperation, had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for it. It had produced children and grandchildren who knew the value of kindness and commitment because they had seen it modeled in the devotion Dustin and Rose showed each other every single day. It had created a legacy that would outlive them both, a reminder that love, when nurtured and protected and given freely, can transform not just two lives, but generations. In the end, it was a story about the power of choice, the importance of stopping when someone needs help, the magic that can happen when two people find each other at exactly the right moment. It was a story about the Wild West, about hardship and hope, about building something from nothing and holding on tight when things got rough. But most of all, it was a story about love, the kind of deep, abiding, transformative love that changes everything and lasts forever. And it all began on a rainy September night in 1887, when a cowboy named Dustin McCoy saw a woman named Rose Keller standing in the rain, locked out of her house, and made the decision to take her somewhere warm and safe. It was a decision that changed both their lives forever, and in the best possible way, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories start with the simplest act of human kindness. Their story ended not with goodbyes, but with a love that transcended death itself, living on in the hearts and memories of all who knew them and all who would come after. A shining example of what it means to truly love another person with your whole heart for your whole life.